Just waiting for it to go live on YouTube. Okay, here we go. All right. So we'll wait for some more people to come. Okay, here we go. All right. So I guess we'll wait like for 5 minutes, and then if no more people come through, we'll just start.
No worries. Yeah, just let me know. What's that sound?
I don't know. No, I'm just going to mute everyone.
Sounds like the algorithmically generated music that we explored for this project. Sounds like the algorithmically generated music that we explored for this project.
What is happening?
Sounds like the algorithmically generated music that.
Okay, sorry about that, everyone.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. No, I just had to mute it to stop that from happening.
You had to mute me, and it fixed. Can you hear me?
I had to mute everyone. Yeah, I can hear you. No, I just had to mute it to stop that from happening.
You had to mute me, and it fixed.
All right.
Can you hear me?
I had to mute. Okay, hold on a second. Oh, it was me. Right. Okay. Let's start. Sorry about that. Cool. We had an interesting little algorithmic music production. Okay. So welcome everyone. I'm your host from Psychedelic Studies Imperial. My name's Nemo. And today, Sean McGowan from Qualia Research Institute is going to be talking about haptic stimulation to generate healing states in psychedelic therapy. Sean studied at Dartmouth College. He studied cognitive science and mathematical physics. And he's the current research and development coordinator for Qualia Research Institute, which aims to discover the mathematical structure of consciousness. So the way we're going to do this is Sean's going to speak, and then we're going to have a Q&A. So you'll get your chance to answer questions at the end. All right, take it away, Sean.
Cool. So you guys can see my screen here, the haptic exploration. Awesome. So yeah, my name is Sean McGowan. I'm from the Qualia Research Institute, a nonprofit neuroscience group exploring the mathematical structure of qualia and consciousness more generally. So just for a tiny bit of background for those who are unfamiliar with our work, CureI was founded in 2016 by Michael Johnson and Andres Gomez Emerson at the top. And since then, we've grown to a team of 5 full-time, and then a host of interns and volunteers who've done a lot of help along the way. Our work covers a few different topics under the umbrella of consciousness, including quantifying the visual effects of psychedelics with a psychophysics tool, quantifying a person's pleasure in highly blissful states. So, for example, MDMA, 5-MeO-DMT, jhana meditations, and using measures of consonance and dissonance inspired by music theory and signal processing. So for more of our work, you can check out our website or reach out to me or Andres in the chat, and we're always happy to talk about our work. We're also interested in detailed exploration of parts of the state space of consciousness. So, for example, Andres has done a lot of work in mapping the space of smell. We host a phenomenology club every week or every 2 weeks, in which we invite advanced meditation practitioners, psychonauts, to speak about their experiences. So yeah, and lastly, we aim to apply a lot of our insights to work in psychedelic therapy to make it as pleasing and healing as possible. So it's really in these last 2 categories, in state space exploration and psychedelic therapy, that this presentation really falls under. So today I'll be talking about some work that a volunteer named Ryan and I did between February and May of this year in exploring the phenomenology of haptic vibration. So just a brief note for those who are not familiar with haptics, these are essentially low frequency vibrations that can be physically felt on the skin. So typically these are between 0 and 120 hertz, basically like wearing a subwoofer. And the specific device we used was a brand called Subpack, which has a few different products, which are all basically variations of the same thing. And so these 2 photos are example of a Subpack product. So as I put in the description for this talk, the motivation for this research came from the fact that a lot of the work that we see going into the set and setting for safe and effective psychedelic therapy focuses on the semantic content of the participant's experience. And of course, the semantic content of a person's thoughts and feelings and emotions is highly impactful for the profundity and the efficacy of a session. But we also believe that the general texture of a person's experience is highly indicative of how healing a session is. And this texture can profoundly impact the likelihood of a positive session by influencing this texture in some way. But aside from some work being done in curating the music for these sessions, I actually saw an album came out yesterday by John Hopkins titled Music for Psychedelic Therapy. So it's timely. But you know, on top of this, we think there's a huge opportunity in influencing the texture of a person's experience by way of multimodal sensory stimulation. So we envision a more mature technology that combines light and sound and vibration to help guide a participant through pleasing and healing trajectories in the consciousness state space. So we have a working prototype of this device, but for this work, we mostly focused on specifically haptic stimulation. So my aims for this presentation are pretty much 4-fold. First is to just provide some general comments on the phenomenology of haptic stimulation. And then as well, some notes on specific stimulation patterns that we explored. In an ideal world, I could share some of these patterns that we found real time in this presentation. It would take too long, and I'm also assuming most don't have access to a haptic device. So if you are interested in feeling some of these textures, again, reach out to me or Andres or maybe Nemo. We could send some your way. Thirdly, we'd like to motivate further research into haptic vibration for use in psychedelic therapy, and to provide a jumping off point for those interested in doing so. This is really just a beginning. And then lastly, I really wanted to just provide a toy example of what qualia exploration and qualia mapping might look like generally. So with that, the specific goal of this project was to explore and then eventually create the foundational patterns of haptic stimulation that could be used with a more mature multisensory device to generate pleasing and healing states. So we were focused on kind of the fundamental building blocks, or the backbone that more complex content could be built on top of in the future. The metaphor we used was, if we're trying to make a tomato soup, our task is to find the cream necessary for the tomato soup, not the tomatoes. And this exploration had two general phases. So first, mapping the boundaries of the phenomenal space, kind of like mapping the border of a continent. And then two, to detail some of the fine differences that live within specific locations in this space. This is the block by block cartography within a neighborhood in the state space. So through the exploration, we asked ourselves questions like, how do pleasant and unpleasant sensations manifest? How long do they take to set in? And does it depend on your pre-existing state of consciousness? What is the complexity of the stimuli? What is this effect on the phenomenology? Are there body region specific effects? And most importantly, and even subconsciously, does your body look forward to the stimulation? So all of these would be helpful for using haptic stimulation in a psychedelic therapy context. So here's a long list of all the exploration categories we went through when it was all said and done. So we explored simple 40 hertz stimulation, whether or not certain patterns resonate with individual nerve clusters in the heart and solar plexus in particular, fractal audio of a variety of types, nature sounds, constant frequency, varying amplitude tones, which I'll be calling VibLab for this presentation, solfeggio frequencies, which dominate the YouTube meditation videos, a few audio effects and illusions like shepherd tones and risette tones, simple heartbeat-like beats such as gongs, microtonal music, isochronic beats, speaking voices like ASMR and Tibetan throat singing, and then lastly, to a tiny extent, what we're calling meat sounds. So basically just sounds of vibrating flesh. So overall, what was a little disappointing, especially at first, was that it became clear that the vast majority of patterns did not feel good really at all. And so looking back, we spent a ton of time searching the borders of this space to try and find some diamonds in the rough, but this was mostly to no avail because the further and further we deviated from the hyper simple patterns, which I'll talk about later, usually the further from this tomato soup cream that we got. So just being optimistic, a no result is still information. So I like to contextualize the work as doing the needed exploration so that a subsequent engineer or content creator or somebody else exploring haptic stimulation in the context of psychedelic therapy doesn't need to turn over some of these rocks themselves, and they have a good jumping off point. So I will go over just a few of these categories in detail. And yeah, just so for a brief outline, I'll first lay out some of the patterns we explored and some super simple categorization of them. I'll then go over some high-level comments on haptic exploration more generally. And then I'll go through each of these categories, or some subset of the categories we explored in our aim to map the boundaries in a little bit of depth. And then I'll walk through some of the fine-grained exploration that we did for fractal audio and VibLab. Yeah, and then lastly, just a few notes on what I think would be interesting to explore next. So over time, it became clear that the four phenomenal dimensions of valence, complexity, arousal, and loving kindness spanned the space pretty well. And it's important to note that these are phenomenal dimensions. So for example, complexity is not formally defined here. So on the right is my poor attempt to render a 4D space on 2D. And so for each of these dimensions, we found that constant frequency, varying amplitude tones, which again, I'll call VibLab, exactly self-similar fractal audio, statistical fractals, and Tibetan gongs were the essence of valence, complexity, arousal, and loving kindness, respectively. So we can essentially view each of these patterns as representing something like the boundary of a portion of the state space. So as you can imagine, loving kindness and valence, and then complexity and arousal are certainly not orthogonal or independent, but they're more distinct than you might think, given that, for example, very low tempo, low volume, complex patterns could be not arousing at all. And then similarly, loving kindness and valence, also certainly related, not independent, but we figured it was still worth teasing apart loving kindness as its own category, given that loving kindness is very much a goal state that we're after, especially for psychedelic therapy usage. So this is just a broad categorization of the categories that we explored. So each of the categories we explored should lie somewhere in this four-dimensional space. And here's a reference table for each of these categories. So for example, 40 hertz, isochronic beats, constant frequency, varying amplitude, and fractal sounds. This is a subset of the categories that are here on the left. And then a rough estimate of the categories corresponding valence, arousal, complexity, and loving kindness inducing effects. These are labeled simply low, low plus, medium, medium plus, high, and high plus. So some things to note on this slide. In bold here are the essences of each of the dimensions that I noted on the previous slide. So for example, VibLab induced a high valence effect in bold here. Exactly self-similar fractal audio induced a strong arousal effect. Statistical fractals were the most phenomenally complex, and Tibetan gongs had the largest impact on feelings of loving kindness. And then in green are the impacts of audio on certain dimensions that are difficult to categorize because they're highly dependent on the participant's incoming emotional state. So it's difficult to generalize. So now I'm just going to mention some notes about haptic stimulation generally. The first general comment is what I mentioned before. There seem to be a very small cluster of patterns that feel pleasing and healing, and that we see as having any potential to be the backbone of more complex content. However, there are a few patterns, such as fractal audio, which I'll get into later, which may not be pleasing standalone, but like in music, could be used intelligently in the set, or the overall track or session as a whole to frame the more pleasing patterns that we did find. Second thing to note is that in a more mature technology that has several independent haptic devices, which we started playing around with at the end, each can be playing their own different simple and consonant stimulation on a different body part, so that the experience as a whole can be complex and interesting if done carefully. Meanwhile, each individual haptic is still receiving a very simple tone or a simple pattern. So for some more general comments, first, the openness of one's nervous system to receiving information prior to stimulation is crucial. So the openness is defined very loosely or intuitively here, but for example, the more closed or knotted or in pain a bodily area is, the less impact stimulation will have on the texture of a person's experience. Conversely, after meditation, or in the context of this talk, psychedelic therapy, a nervous system, which I would informally call open to receiving information, gets heavily impacted. I think this makes intuitive sense. And it also checks out with some of our other work, which explains some of the dynamics of meditation and psychedelics as a form of neural annealing. So the second note is, because of this, sessions should start with what I'll call a spot treatment, essentially destructively interfering with dissonant bodily patterns and making the participant's body more open to receiving information. And I'll talk about this more later, but this could look like, for example, starting the session with super complex fractal audio in certain locations, and then slowly transitioning toward less complex fractal audio, and then eventually towards simple, constant frequency, varying amplitude sounds. The third thing to note is that essentially all forms of haptic stimulation raise energy levels compared to the baseline of lying down with no stimulation. For most of us, just spending 20 minutes lying down will be relaxing. But it was extremely difficult to find any pattern of haptic stimulation that effectively lowered one's energy levels more so than simply lying down for a long time. So lastly, the max stimulation time for us at least was roughly 50 to 60 minutes within a 4 to 5 hour period. Anything beyond that became much too agitating and overwhelming. So just for some more general comments, we found that what a person is attending to during a session, food, and posture are the three most important input variables for the impactfulness of a session. Presumably, if somebody's under a psychedelic drug, this would obviously be an extremely relevant input condition. So it would probably take precedence over these three. Yeah, so just a couple notes on that. If you're not attending to the stimulation or the experience, the stimulation would likely either be annoying or unimpactful at the very best. Second, it's best with an empty stomach. Third, we found it to be best when you're lying down in kind of like a yoga shavasana style. Second, the effects of multisensory systems are highly nonlinear. So when we moved on from just the haptic and played haptic stimulations in tandem with light and sound, the effects were so much stronger. And of course, these are just rough phenomenal estimates, but we believed haptic and music to have about 3 to 4 times the effect size of haptic alone. And then haptic and music and lights had about 2 to 3 times the effect size of haptic and music. So this finding helps motivate why we think such exploration and multisensory stimulation could be so helpful for psychedelic treatment. I expect these nonlinearities to hold and probably even increase when used with psychedelics. And so this is definitely not confirmed, but we can imagine such a device potentially lowering the dosage required for certain treatments. And just anecdotally from reports, using some of the prototypes that we've been working with, that definitely seems to be the case. And I personally think this could be particularly impactful for ketamine or MDMA therapy, in which the physiological effects are non-trivial. So yeah, last thing to note here on haptic stimulation more generally, at least in this slide, is much of the work is done in the periods of non-stimulation. So in other words, you build energy with the haptics and then you drop into a haptic silence, if you will. Yes, so okay, the last general comments. First is that the body interprets haptic consonance / dissonance in terms of the consonance or dissonance of the other sensory modalities that are occurring. So, for example, if the audio that's being played in tandem is consonant or dissonance, the haptic will correspondingly feel more consonant or dissonance. Second is that physical engagement is very important. So several participants noted that it's imperative that you feel like you have some control or ownership over the experience so that it's not disembodied or happening to you. So it would be ideal if future versions of a device like this could have a sense of responsiveness. So for example, one participant loved touching different parts of the sub pack while it was vibrating because it gave the sensation of responsiveness. And just to note, this was particularly true for female participants that tried the device. Related to this is that haptic stimulation makes the body feel at risk more readily. So any session utilizing haptic stimulation should heavily optimize for safety. The participant should feel as comfortable and trusting as possible. And of course, people in the psychedelic therapy space know much more about this than I do. But we found that downward weight on top of the shoulders with, for example, a weighted blanket worked really well for this. Yes, so, and then fourthly, Of course, like music, the experience of the current stimulation is highly dependent on the context of stimulation in which it's embedded. So, in other words, the previous stimulations matter. However, I found that the decay rate of haptic is much lower. So, for example, I would feel the effects of vibration far longer after stopping than I do with audio. And yeah, so the context of previous stimulation matters even more than in audio because the body memory lasts so long and interacts with the current stimulation. And then lastly, last general note is that the hands and the feet handle complexity very well, which makes intuitive sense. So even though we didn't explore this too much, I think haptic stimulation on the hands and feet in particular, there's a lot of work to be done here. So for example, maybe with a technology like Ultraleap, which is designed to work on the hand, to provide haptic stimulation on the hand. So now onto some comments for specific investigations. We first started with 40 hertz stimulation. We were excited about this given its recent use in Alzheimer's insomnia treatment. And these have been mostly done in the auditory and visual domain. So we wanted to see whether we could transfer this to tactile sensations. But because 40 hertz is so simple, our boredom mechanism kicks in very quickly. So we tried to see how we could frame periods of 40 hertz stimulation to reduce boredom and have the user attend more to the 40 hertz stimulation when it was actually occurring. So we tried 40 hertz and its harmonics within the sub-frequency range. So within the 0 to 120, 140-ish hertz. Actually, in this case, we brought up to 160 because that 160 is basically the max threshold that you can feel physically. So overall, we did not find 40 hertz to be very promising. It mostly induced vague agitation when played for more than just a couple of minutes. And Andres also experienced some sleep paralysis. So overall, not super promising, but just a few notes. First is that 40 hertz and plus or minus 2 harmonics was the max that should be used at any one time. So more than 2 harmonics was too overwhelming. Second, definitely the attack and the decay should be as long as possible or else it's too jarring. Next is that transitioning was best between plus or minus 1 harmonic. So from 10 to 20 or from 40 to 20 or from 80 to 40, that's okay. But from 80 to 10, that would be also a little bit too dramatic and agitating. Further, we found the sub 40 hertz harmonics were especially helpful for raising the energy parameter, is what we like to say, and allowing the 40 hertz to be the drop to help ensure that the user paid attention to it. And lastly, we created a sample audio whose image is on the right, which incorporates these harmonics and audio of nature sounds like cows eating grass. So overall, was not left feeling extremely optimistic, though, about 40 hertz. Next, we tried a few classical audio illusions, like the shepherd tone, which essentially contains a series of sine waves an octave apart. There's an image on the right here, that are constantly rising or falling in frequency within a constant amplitude envelope. And this gives the illusion of continually rising or falling pitch. And then the next thing we tried was the Rizit beat, which formally is equivalent to the shepherd tone, but you're substituting frequency for tempo. So instead of an illusion of falling or rising pitch, it gives the illusion of speeding up or slowing down. And the shepherd tone didn't do much for us on the haptic, but the Rizit beat had an amazingly cool effect of feeling like your bodily organs were continually slowing down. Felt like the digital version of a chill pill. So the Rizit beats we experimented with, they didn't have pleasing textures. So if somebody here is skilled at making Rizit beats, it would be very worthwhile creating a Rizit beat with a texture that feels really good on a haptic device. And again, we created a brief audio clip. So all these audio clips, again, if somebody's interested in feeling them, reach out to one of us. So beyond illusions, we investigated the following audio effects. So smoothing, panning, echo, and reverb had significant impact on the experience. Some others that we tried, such as the dryness, wetness, vocoder, saturation, and flanging didn't. So with respect to smoothing, abrupt changes are the bane of haptic stimulation. So making the ASDR as extended as possible is pretty critical. So everything that we really tried, we wound up smoothing. Second, for panning, the subpack itself is in stereo, so we could only explore this when we built the more mature LSV device. But both left and right and up and down panning has an incredible effect. So, for example, Andres and I explored a continual staircase style ratcheting up and down of both the frequency and the amplitude of panning. And this does a couple of things. So first of all, it seems to really add a dimensionality to the experience. So for example, super high frequency, super high amplitude, left-right panning generated what one of us described as a tornado effect. It basically added a dimension perpendicular to the plane of a person lying down, for example. It added that third dimension. And next, up and down panning with both the top and bottom haptics. So in our more mature device, we had several different haptic pillows under a person's back and then under a person's back of their legs. And when you pan up and down, this generates a washing or cleansing feeling. It feels like waves going from head to toe. And the second thing that panning really does is increase the energy parameter in a pleasing way. So this is very useful for a drop into haptic silence, as I was describing before. Another note on panning is that it's super synergistic. So when you couple it with the headphones and panning of a light device, which I'll talk about later, you could generate a very, very interesting, very trippy experience. So just a couple more notes. We found the max panning frequency of the headphones to be about a quarter note, and anything past that is too hectic. And you could bring the panning amplitude all the way up to 100%. And then lastly, on the audio effects, we also explored reverb and echo. So like in the audio domain, reverb gave the feeling of spaciousness, and it was super important. Basically everything got some amount of reverb on it. Next, we explored super simple, slow percussion style beats to use as heartbeats. So in these sessions, we used these to introduce the track in the beginning and also as a closer, as like an outro after the rest of the stimulation had died down. So by far the most heart-opening sound we found was an example of this. This was a sample of a Tibetan gong whose waveform is on the right. It's super beautiful waveform. In some ways, I shouldn't characterize it as a heartbeat because it's quite intense, and we use it pretty sparingly and much lower than, for example, a 60 beats per minute heartbeat. But its texture was amazing. And when played through the whole setup with multiple haptic devices, it would generate goosebumps pretty consistently. And then last, we weren't able to experiment with this, but I think it'd be interesting to have the heartbeat tempo of the song adjust according to the person's current heartbeat via biofeedback. And you need to do this intelligently. You couldn't have it transition too quickly. You'd have to have some, like weighted average of, X previous time steps of a person's heartbeat. I'll go over this quickly, but next we tried isochronic tones, which are essentially quickly repeating beats of a particular tone. So the image on the top right, essentially a tone being turned on and off very rapidly. These are sometimes compared to binaural beats, but they're pretty different. And we found that these should only be used sparingly and for short periods, usually early in the track to, again, like raise the energy parameter and to transition out of noise and more complex sounds. So I don't have the time to go through all these categories. So very briefly, we also explored speaking voices, which we found to be extremely comforting, especially the cadence and the dynamics of speaking voice. So not the texture. It really felt like you were, it felt like either you were lying close to someone in bed or in a womb. So very comforting. So in the future, matching the rhythm or the dynamics of a speaking voice with a different texture would be a great project. We also explored whether we could stimulate particular nerve clusters in our heart and solar plexus. Next, we also explored microtonal music, in particular, something called polychromatic music, which essentially extends the number of notes between octaves. So instead of 12 notes between octaves, polychromatic has 106. And then solfeggio frequencies, and nature sounds of a variety of types. Streams, oceans, rain, these surprisingly all had pretty different effects. And then also womb sounds. I contacted a researcher from New Zealand who had recorded sounds from the interior of a sheep's womb in 2003. And I wanted to try that out, but I never heard back. So great. So the last two categories are the two most important. I'll dive into both of them in more depth and try and tease apart some fine differences. So the first I'm calling VibLab because it comes from a tradition of vibroacoustic therapy that was started in the 1980s, I think, in Norway. And they converged on the same stimulation, so for use in their therapy. So these are very simple, just a single frequency with a varying amplitude. This amplitude envelope can be either sine wave, like on the top, or a triangle wave, like on the bottom. The triangle waves are of course more abrupt, a little bit less calming, and so vibroacoustic therapy uses them as a warm-up before applying the sine wave amplitude ones. A few notes just at the front. We found these to be by far the most pleasing pattern. So this was a staple for all of the tracks that we made. In particular, we found that 40, 50, 60, 68, and 86 hertz were particularly pleasing. And we also found that the lower frequencies worked well on lower parts of the body, and that lower parts of the body required more intense stimulation for these patterns to be meaningful. So as I said, I'll go into these in a bit more detail a little bit later. So then the last major category was fractal audio. So there are three main kinds, which we'll talk about in a sec: exactly self-similar, quasi-selfsimilar, and statistical fractals. All were too complex and agitating to be pleasant for long periods. However, over time, we realized they could be extremely effective when used intelligently in mainly two ways. So first, as a spot treatment for body areas with a lot of dissonance. So for example, a tight or anxious chest or chronic backache, it could do well to like destructively interfere with those areas. And second, when used in the beginning of a session to raise a participant's energy level before introducing simpler, more consonant tones like the VibLab tones. So basically all of our tracks wound up including fractal audio in the beginning of them, but they were way too agitating to be used at the end of a session when hopefully a participant's nervous system would be open to receiving information at that point. So one thing to note here is that we didn't do extensive investigation into fractal audio in conjunction with psychedelics, and it's going to be very important. A future research project that experiments with fractal audio with participants under the effect of psychedelics. So anyway, lastly, because fractal audio was really the archetypical complex audio, we chose it as a region in the Qualia space to investigate more precisely and tease apart fine differences. So at this point, given the scope of the project, we wanted to map the fine differences of what we're calling the essence of complexity and valence. So for complexity, the 3 kinds of fractal audio, and then for valence, this VibLab, constant frequency, varying amplitude tones that I described previously. So yeah, just for a bit of background on fractal audio, there are 3 main types in order of decreasing complexity. So decreasing phenomenal complexity, again, not mathematically defined yet. And these are exactly self-similar, quasi-self-similar, and statistical. So I'm not going to get into too much of the weeds here, but essentially exactly self-similar fractal refers to a fractal that is identical at all scales. So the coach triangle or the coach snowflake on the top right is a perfect example. You start with a triangle, you chop each side into 3 pieces, and then you add a triangle to the middle piece, and you iterate this, and you get the snowflake as shown. You can basically do the same process with a melody, an initial melody, and a fixed transformation. And then you have statistical self-similarity, which still involves an iterative process, but some aspect of this process is pulled from a random distribution. And as we'll see in a bit, any number of random distributions can work here. So for example, we explored Gaussian and uniform distributions. And an example of this is the coastline of Britain. And then lastly is quasi-self-similarity, which lies between these two, between exact and statistical self-similarity. And a perfect example of this is the satellites in the Mandelbrot set, which are on the bottom right. And there's certain satellites, basically certain parts of the object that contain full copies of the entire figure, usually distorted in some way. So first we explored the exactly self-similar audio. One we found interesting was an algorithm that basically mimicked this coach snowflake, but for audio. I won't go into the algorithm here, but if someone's interested, I could definitely chat about it later. We also tried spectrograms generated from 4th power Mandelbrot sets. These are both interesting to hear, but definitely not to feel. They were unbelievably chaotic, and I can't really see how they'd ever be used, especially under the effect of a psychedelic. So yeah, not super promising there. Next were quasi-self-similar fractals, which combine random sound generation with logical constraints, as I previously mentioned. And to explore these, we built a track using a Max for Live plugin called Inspired by Nature, with an instrument titled Tree Tone, which is essentially a mix of FM and granular synthesis. And anyway, essentially, for all intents and purposes, it's a quasi-self-similar piece or track, because basically certain components of the audio are self-similar, analogous to the Mandelbrot set satellites. So just a couple of phenomenal notes here. Arousal, we basically viewed as a kind of backwards S. Valence as pretty much unaffected, but slight increase linearly. Contentment as an S shape, and calmness as kind of logarithmic. I thought this track felt quite nice. It made me focused. The phrase tessellated by texture kept repeating in my mind, and it felt like I was wearing the texture like an article of clothing even after I stopped the stimulation. And the three adjectives I would describe this stimulation would be I felt touched, soothed, and buttery. Yeah. So next, small differences. The last kind of fractals, statistical fractals. These were by far the most pleasurable out of the fractal set. So we use them as an opportunity to tease apart a little bit more fine-grained differences. So there are 7 or so different kinds of noise color, like fractal audio color. So basically, statistical fractals are fractals whose numerical or statistical properties are preserved across scales. An example of this would be rolling 2 dice, and when you add the results, you get a number between 6 and 36. and let's say each number gets assigned to a particular note on a scale. So for example, the 6 could be the C below middle C, 7 could be, the following D, et cetera, et cetera. And there are 6 main categories. So violet, blue, gray, white, pink, and brown noise. These are some of the power spectra of these different noise colors. So, y-axis is the amplitude, x is the frequency. So for example, you have, where's white noise? So you have white noise with a uniform distribution, then brown noise with its notes shifted towards the lower frequencies. Blue noise is the opposite, etc. For violet, we basically needed to transpose everything down so that we could feel it on the subpack, because as you can see, it's all above 120 hertz. So yeah, we basically put these different types of noise into a single track that walks through 10 seconds or so of each of these noise colors to test whether we could feel any difference. And this was very tough. So Ryan and I tried several single blind tests over the course of a few weeks, and it seemed like we couldn't tell any difference, except that when played for long periods of time, we seemed to get bored less quickly when we would cycle between different noises. So so essentially it seemed like our bodies were picking up on a subtle difference that we couldn't even consciously notice for ourselves, at least real time. And so I'm very interested to see if someone either more sensitive or a more astute phenomenologist could pick up on some of the differences here. So even though it's difficult to discriminate between colors, we tried another level of specificity. So noise pulled either from a Gaussian or a uniform distribution. Similar deal here. Unfortunately, we couldn't tell any difference between these. As you can see from a screenshot of the power spectra over time on the right, between these two distributions, the shapes are pretty similar. These are constantly changing power spectra, so you have to kind of look at the top line, which represents the highest amplitudes reached at each frequency. So unfortunately couldn't find any difference at this level of specificity, but again, interested to see if somebody can, and if so, what the differences would be. So then I got into a little bit of a rabbit hole trying to quantify the complexity of some of the audio that we were listening to, and seeing whether we could use fractal dimension as a good metric of complexity. There's a ton of ways to do this, which are all pretty much equivalent when the input is continuous, but very different when the input is digital, like a digital time series. So we got some of the code for calculating the Higuchi dimension, which is essentially approximating the box counting dimension, which is also called the Minkowski dimension, but for a time series. So yeah, I don't need to get into the box counting algorithm, but again, if you're interested, I can explain later. But here are some of the so here are some of the Higuchi dimensions of some various audio that we tried. So for example, the Higuchi dimension of brown noise was between 1.812 and 1.886, bird song between 1.913 and 1.968, etc. Just a couple of promising signs of this Higuchi dimension as a metric for complexity. First is that it did seem pretty consistent between categories. So for example, all of the brown noises are within 1.81 and 1.88. All the bird songs are between 1.91 and 1.96. And then also a given pattern's Higuchi dimension aligns well with its phenomenal complexity. So for example, VibLab, the super simple constant frequency amplitude envelope that I've been discussing previously, had by far the lowest fractal dimension, which is great because it also had the lowest phenomenal complexity. And then on the other side, brown noise has a super high dimension, which checks out as it being some of the most complex audio that we investigated. And then one thing to note here, one deviation from this is that brown noise was phenomenally far more complex than birdsong, but its fractal dimension was less. So definitely need more sample sizes to determine how this, Higuchi dimension or something like a fractal dimension stands as a metric of complexity. So here are just a few notes on the phenomenology of noise in general. Overall, in terms of pleasantness, statistical fractals are more pleasant than quasi-self-similar, which are far more pleasant than exactly self-similar. Next is that noise is the most efficient pattern at neutralizing dissonance, the best spot treatment for body areas and pain. It also, interestingly, had this effect of bringing you to a constant, is how I described it, for a variety of emotions. So, for example, if you were a 9 out of 10 arousal coming in, it would bring you to a 6 out of 10. But if you're at a 4 out of 10 coming in, it would also bring you to a 6 out of 10. Basically, all points would asymptote towards there, towards, for example, 6 out of 10 for any reasonable amount of time. And this held true for a variety of motions. It also held true for chest anxiety, for example. We also noticed that valence effects, so essentially the pleasure of pain, decay quite quickly after the stimulation is over, while the effects on arousal took much longer to decay. This might always be the case, given how physiological arousal seems to be. For example, regulating sympathetic or parasympathetic systems, all that. While for on the other hand, valence can really turn on a knob instantly. So yeah, anyway, this is probably always the case, but the effect seemed particularly true after noise compared to some of the other categories that we explored. The threshold was consistently 10 to 12 minutes. Any more than that became far too agitating, and definitely to be played at the beginning of a track. At the end of a track, it could become quite disconcerting. So so we basically used noise at the beginning of all of our tracks to raise participants' energy parameter. Great. Okay, so and then so for fine differences for the VibLab, the last specific category. So basically the last category we want to explore in depth was this constant frequency varying amplitude VibLab, which again was by far the most pleasing sound in the whole project overall. We found the following frequencies to have significantly distinct bodily effects. So we felt 50 hertz primarily in the chest and lungs area. We found that it was best when using the subpack horizontally. And it was also best to breathe in during the stimulation. We found 60 hertz was really felt at the high front of the chest and the low throat. And 68 hertz was very, very pleasing in the upper back, neck, and shoulder area. And then 86 hertz at the head and temple region. These were honestly very distinct for me, which surprised me. So another thing to note is that the frequency of amplitude modulation that we used for this VibLab was all about 1/6 of a second. Just a couple more notes here. One interesting thing that we noticed was that one of the things that I didn't really talk about in depth was exploring different nerve cluster resonance for the heart and solar plexus. And in that investigation, there was a wide discrepancy between Ryan and I. So Ryan felt, like 86 hertz in his heart area, and I felt that what most resonated with my heart area was something like 40 or 50. So there's a large discrepancy earlier when we examined this, and these were for just pure constant tones. But as soon as you add this amplitude envelope that VibLab has, this changes things, and there's a lot of convergence. There was a lot of convergence between me and Ryan and several other participants. Basically, the same frequency was felt in the same regions in different people. So I don't yet know why it is the case that this amplitude envelope is having this effect, but it's very interesting. So need some more work to determine why that is the case. Great. So one question we had here is, for psychedelic therapy treatment session, for example, how could we best personalize this for an individual? Is there a way of determining more precisely the resonant frequency of a person's different organs, for example, and adjusting the stimulation accordingly? Again, that would require more work. Yeah, so that's it for the specific category, investigations. But just stepping back and talking about some lessons we learned and some next steps. So with these findings, we generated 2 tracks by the end, about 20 to 25 minutes in length. One of them we called like loving kindness, and one of them was energizing. And so, like I mentioned, by the end of the project, we were experimenting with light and sound on top of the haptics. So these tracks incorporated all 3 sense modalities. It would be much easier to just show you guys what we created, but it's obviously not feasible right now. So I'll say a couple of notes about the tracks that we ended up making. So both tracks included a subset of what I've gone over today. On the haptic side, the main contributors in order in which they were introduced in the track. First, we began with a heartbeat, basically to just focus somebody's attention. Then for this loving kindness track, we used a risit beat to really slow things down. Then we added a period of around 30 seconds to a minute of statistical fractals, usually brown noise, to raise a participant's energy parameter. And then we introduced a couple of gongs to open the nervous system, really. We used a bit more gongs in the love and kindness track than the energizing track. And then the main portions of the track were dominated by VibLab, this constant frequency varying amplitude tone, as essentially simple consonant patterns to anneal around after somebody's energy parameter has been raised. And then mixed in with this were the occasional isochronic beats and sometimes noise, mostly in the energizing track. And then we basically finished with a few gongs to kind of end the session around the super loving kindness sensation, and then an outro heartbeat. So in terms of audio effects, we used a ton of panning. Panning would usually start low and then continuously ratchet up in frequency and amplitude of both up and down and left right panning. And the panning was most extreme in like right before a drop. And we also synced the panning in the haptic with panning in other modalities. So other, also light and also sound. So 3 sensory modality panning. Reverb was always used. Similarly, all patterns had highly smoothed ASDR envelopes. And then lastly, just for audio, we used a couple of classic Buddhist and Catholic chants, so namely Om So Hum, Om Mani Padme Hum, as well as some nature sounds, primarily in the beginning and end. And then in terms of lights, we used a setup called the Light Casino, essentially just a set of goggles with a colored LCD display, and we hard-coded some patterns that aligned with both the haptic and the audio. And you could do certain, effects with that, such as panning. Great, so lessons learned. Yeah, so basically just a few notes on doing this kind of research and what we think might be fruitful avenues to explore, for future exploration. First is that we began constructing a subpack Qualia diary to help guide further explorations. It's pretty simple, just a text document right now with some basic graphs on it that somebody can describe their experience with. Ideally, though, we could turn this template into a GUI, an interactive visual display with, for example, interactive sliders for different qualia over time, things like that. So again, if someone's interested in helping with that project, contact us. Next, we found it was important to trust your intuition. So vague notions of this feels good or this feels bad are very fruitful, especially in the beginning. Second, we found that more than 2 to 3 hours of total stimulation per day was the max. And we recommended oscillating between stimulation and then like exploration or analysis in order to prevent burnout, if you're doing this full time. Third, it's very easy to over categorize before exploring. So this is one of my main notes. By the end, we found it much better to just let your intuition guide you. Then you could categorize what you've explored afterwards. And then you could also use categorization to determine what regions of the state space you may not have explored yet. And also, it might not seem like it, but phenomenology is absolutely a skill. You can improve this skill over time, but its fruits may not be as apparent as other skill development. And then just for some next steps, my partner and I flirted with the idea of spatial audio on Haptic, but it turns out this is too difficult for us. And I don't know of anybody that's replicated spatial audio on haptics, definitely above my pay grade. But I think it could be very cool, could add great dimensionality to the experience. I don't expect that Subpack in particular would be able to handle this because it's mono, not stereo, but the back haptics that we created, these haptic pillows, I think would be able to. Second, I think it'd be very interesting to explore patterns on the hands and feet, as I mentioned before, because they can discriminate frequency differences in much more detail. So, using something like Ultraleap would be really interesting. Next, of course, to utilize something like OpenAI's Jukebox or MuseNet and train a model on a large enough set of enjoyable patterns to create, basically infinitely repeating loops with variations to prevent against boredom. Next, there is a paper from MIT Media Lab in 2013 in which they built a haptic suit with 13 transducers on it. They were able to generate what they called the cutaneous rabbit effect, which is essentially the illusion of continuous motion playing across the skin by timing the stimulation of the actuators in a particular way. I would love to recreate this. Third, our categorization was pretty simple, into those 4 dimensions, but teasing these dimensions apart into finer detail, of course, valuable, and would be the next, post-exploration phase in any good Qualia investigation. Just a couple more notes. We want to generate spectrograms or chromograms, which are basically spectrograms binned into the corresponding notes for each set of frequencies, using 2D wallpaper symmetry groups, which are here on the right. Usually the 17 ways that you can tessellate a 2-dimensional surface. Andres is definitely the person to speak about this in more detail with. And then just a more robust understanding of the synergies between different sense modalities. So for example, does greater haptic complexity modulate auditory arousal or valence? Is there a particular consonant or dissonant audio that when played in conjunction with haptics changes the consonance or dissonance of the audio? And then lastly, simply explore more of the state space. Even though we found much of the state space to be unpromising for pleasing and healing vibrations, there might be some islands filled with diamonds. So hopefully somebody can find these. Really just the last note. The majority of our work was done in mapping the phenomenology space, but making a clean mapping between this space and the input space by categorizing the input space more mathematically, like what we started to do with the Higuchi Dimension, and mapping that onto phenomenal complexity. So doing more of this, I think, is going to be really fruitful. So for example, maybe mapping between tempo or average amplitude and arousal. And then the step after this would be comparing the mapping in the haptic space to a mapping in another sensory domain, such as audio. What aspects of this mapping are retained, which aspects change, etc. That's all I've got. I hope some of that was interesting and or helpful. As I mentioned, this is really just a brief introduction to some of the phenomenology of haptic qualia. But I think there's a ton of potential here, both standalone and in conjunction with psychedelic therapy. So again, if anyone's interested in this type of work, either creating content for this prototype, helping to develop this prototype itself, or qualia exploration or haptic exploration of any kind, please reach out to us. Love to talk. And I just wanted to say thank you to CureI team, especially Andres, who really outlined and motivated this entire project. So many of the topics that I talked about today stem from him. So very grateful for that, and also grateful for Quentin being my stimulation guinea pig. Literally would not have done it without them. So yeah, nice. That's all I've got. So maybe we can open up things for Q&A potentially.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. That was really interesting. Yeah, a lot of cool stuff. I think we already have a question. I'm not going to try and pronounce that name, but what kind of shape do you recommend adjusting a frequency generator? Sine, square, sawtooth, or triangle? I think they are
what
asking.
shape? Oh,
Yeah, what kind of
the
shape?
frequency generator?
Form.
Yeah, definitely sine. So we tried saw and triangle, either sine or triangle. Saw sine waves were a little bit gentler. So I would recommend, if you were to use a triangle waveform, then it would be probably used more towards the beginning of the track. It could be a little bit too agitating for the middle to an end of the track. And I think that would be exacerbated under the influence of psychedelics. Yeah.
Okay, if anyone has other questions, just post them in the comments. Okay, there is another one. I don't know what that acronym is. WRT, to future work with voice. It seems like a bass-boosted guided meditation with the subpack could be an interesting service.
Oh, so WRT, I guess, is with respect to, and then what was the next phrase?
Oh yeah, so it seems like a bass-boosted guided meditation with the subpack could be an interesting service.
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of the exploration that we did, I combined in conjunction with doing a meditation. In my personal experience, I found it to be very, very helpful for non-conceptual meditations. So, for example, like doing basic shamatha, or doing like a non-conceptual Brahma Vihara, like for immeasurable loving kindness meditation, worked very well for. I did not find it to be, I found it a little bit too distracting to be used for like an analytical meditation, a conceptually heavy meditation. That was just me. But I agree. We've been talking to a lot of experienced practitioners about how this work and prototype that not only includes haptic but also other sensory modalities could interact with their work. We've spoken to one very experienced jhana meditator who believes that such a device could really, really aid in accessing some of these jhanic states that he accesses. So again, if you're interested, please reach out to any of us.
I think Andres wanted to say something on that as well. Hello, Andres.
Hey, hello everybody, and yeah, thank you, Sean, for the presentation, and Nemo for the space. Yeah, definitely. I think I mean, in the sense, as Sean was saying, for like the more non-conceptual kinds of meditation. So especially meditations that are aimed to produce like specific valence or like quote unquote energetic effects. I think like this sort of technology can provide the target. So let's say like during a guided meditation, they might give you kind of like a little bit of these like very nice like vibrations of the sort that Sean was talking about towards the end, and say like, okay, like an experienced like loving kindness meditator can instantiate these vibrations endogenously, and like maybe for the first part of the meditation is you get acquainted with the actual phenomenology that is the target, and then later on you're trying to, in a sense, replicate it on your own endogenously. And I think it's kind of like a guided, kind of like handrail sort of approach to meditation may potentially, like accelerate it quite a bit, because there's, so many cases where one says like, I'm not sure what the meditation teacher is talking about when you say like, oh, you're going to feel this pleasant vibration in your chest. It's like, well, actually, this is the you can show an example. And I mean, similarly, I mean, you can think of it as like various kind of like interesting phenomenological spaces here that like on the one hand, like one very interesting research project is to find, okay, like what are the, vibratory component of like, advanced like loving kindness meditation, and like characterizing it, formally and mathematically in and of itself also has potentially quite a bit of scientific value. So yeah, that would be, a very important kind of a follow-up to this research.
Thank you for that. So Laura also has another question. Would it be useful to give the user a control with up, down, so they can feel in control even in just a small range with patterns? I don't know what's up.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so the prototype device that we built had simple knobs for each of the haptics, and then the light and sound to modulate the intensity. But for future iterations of the prototype, I think it'd be very, very interesting to have, on top of an intensity dial, to have at least like a consonance and a complexity dial. So depending on where they are in a given either psychedelic session or standalone, they can modulate those themselves. That was about out of the scope of the hardware work for this project, but I think having that type of control would give the participant a lot more safety, and feeling a comfort that they have some engagement and some control over their own experience, and it's not just happening to them. So I think I might have mentioned this, but one woman that we tried kept physically adjusting the shoulder straps and placing her hand on certain parts of the subpack so that she could feel more in control. So making that more concrete in the form of a dial or some other interaction would be the next step.
Laura has another question. I'm not really sure about what this means, but maybe you'll be able to figure out. I know semantic content is not the focus, but are there any pockets that will also be implemented? There seems to be another level going on that is hard to divorce from objective patterns. I guess what she's trying to say is there's like always semantic content that accompanies whatever patterns you're producing.
Yeah, so I think basically one interesting thing that I noticed was that sorry, I'm blanking right now. Sorry, give me one sec. The
I can repeat the question.
Sorry, my brain's
Yeah.
Yeah, could you repeat the question again? Sorry.
You don't know why, it's all right. So yeah, I guess they're asking a bit like, maybe Laura, if you could like clarify what you mean, that might be useful, because I don't really know what you mean by pockets.
I could answer that.
Oh yeah, go on, Andres. Yeah.
Okay. So so I mean, like there is generally at QureI this theme of divorcing semantic content and hedonic tone or valence, and to a large extent they are orthogonal, but they're not completely orthogonal. And one kind of like article that I highly recommend is A Future for Neuroscience by Mike Johnson, the co-founder of QureI, and because he talks about like basically the properties of felt sense, the hedonic tone of felt sense. And it does seem to me quite likely that in a sense, like different aspects of our semantic representations do generally have kind of like intrinsic vibratory components. So there is like a whole range of vibrations that if you experience them, you will naturally, the semantic content that arises will be that of like otherness, or like even like these subtle kind of like propositional feelings like, oh, this is very much of an at type of vibration, or this is very much of an in type of vibration, or this is very much of an outside type of vibration. And like if you listen to kind of exotic music and resonances, you can kind of get that type of propositional content at once. It's like, oh, it feels like this kind of vibration is like something that is outside that is trying to get in, and things like that. So in some sense, yes, there's some aspects of semantic content that are really kind of like intrinsically related to vibratory phenomena. And in that sense, yes, even with absolutely no language, no like explicit references to semantic content, you can still kind of like paint a narrative just based on patterns of vibrations. And in that sense, yes, I mean, there's going to be quite a relationship here. And when it comes to, for example, like healing, deep patterns. I mean, if you think about like this sort of like trauma that comes from, I don't know, rejection from one's parents, just as an example, like it's quite likely that, that is kind of atrophiating particular kind of like propositional qualia, if that makes sense, right? It's kind of like this sense of like, oh, somebody really close to you has like emitted very dissonant vibrations. So like if you can reproduce, particular vibratory patterns that emulate that propositional qualia and then flips the valence to a consonant component, it may be able to heal that particular quality. And in that sense, yes, like semantic content and valence are related in interesting ways, in very non-trivial ways, and they're not completely divorced.
Yeah, that is great. And one before I forgot is essentially that in our sessions with light and sound vibration, we basically had a very simple behavioral algorithm, which was, we tell the participant simple set of instructions, for the first 30 seconds, pay attention to the breath, and then let go into the stimulation. But there's definitely more precise and more complex set of instructions that we could provide to the participants that could potentially incorporate semantic content, later into the session of the type, that Andres was just talking about. So just a more robust kind of behavioral algorithm for a session of the type that psychedelic therapy treatment clinics are experimenting with, I think will be also very synergistic.
On that note, with the breath, I actually had a question. Like, what would you think about syncing the audio with the breath rate?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. I think similarly to the heartbeat, it would be very interesting. So one disconcerting feeling that I had in the beginning of the session, in the beginning of the exploration, was when the heartbeat sound that we were using was slightly off from my breathing rate. Like that slight discrepancy it could be extremely agitating. So having the heartbeat sound that's playing being mapped to either the one's own heartbeat or your breathing rate, I think both of those could be effective. But like I mentioned, it would need to be pretty smoothed out, or like a long weighted average over, like, let's say the last 10 or 20 seconds of a person's breathing rate, or else I think the variability would be too much and it would get potentially erratic. And I could even see like a runaway kind of agitating and anxiety inducing feedback loop. But if done correctly, I think it's a perfect next step. Some biofeedback of a variety of kinds that we've been thinking about.
So I have another question. So with the mapping from audio to phenomenological space, do you think you could sort of identify the transition states between like mind wells that one might get stuck in, for example, with addiction, and be able to sort of map those transition states so that you can move through them in the audio space to better get out of those kind of stuck states?
Yeah. I have a couple of different notes here. First, I think there could be potentially some like escape or like out that the participant could indicate in some way. And I think what you'd want to do is basically input some pattern, maybe brown noise in particular, like a statistical fractal, to basically raise the energy parameter so that they could slide into a different phenomenal space if the one they're in is dissonant in some way. Another thing that just comes to mind, Andres did a lot of work a couple years ago on the transition probabilities between emotional states. So, for example, transitioning from happy to depressed, takes a characteristic trajectory, or like there's certain transition probabilities that are more likely to occur than others. And so I think incorporating certain information like that to really guide somebody's trajectory could be very interesting. And then lastly, this is kind of a whole other aside, but we've also been considering kind of real-time neurofeedback. And I think, with the use of FNIRS or EEG, some other neuroimaging component. And I think that you could potentially also use that as basically an objective marker if somebody's in a pocket of state space that they don't want to be in. And then, again, kind of raise the energy parameter accordingly and have them smoothly transition away.
Very good answer.
Yeah, I could also add a little bit on that. Yeah.
Yeah, go on. Let me put you up.
Yeah. So exactly what Sean was saying, like the matrix of transition probabilities between emotions, so that it's kind of like if you want to transform one state of matter to another, like you have ice, and it's not necessarily possible to actually transform it into vapor, right away. You first need to liquefy it, and then it can actually become a vapor. It can actually become a gas. And likewise, I think like if you have two kind of like a discontinuous approach to therapy, and I think like this sometimes happens with psychedelics. People go to kind of like a very enlightening state of consciousness. They come back, but like integrating it is really difficult because the distance is so large. There's no intermediate steps. But if you have actually mapped in a way, what is the typical set of high probability transitions that are like natural for the nervous system, and you go through them as kind of like a way of guiding the state from the particularly negative or doomed state to maybe kind of like blissful or feeling blessed. The advantage of that as well is that you're actually entraining a particular pattern within a nervous system that in a sense will be able to remember, like how do I actually get there? It's not only kind of like, this North Star that is completely unreachable, you actually know the path towards it. And I think, that's potentially a very, very valuable application of these kind of stimulation patterns.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Like, it doesn't help to know what the destination is. You need to actually know how to get there. Right, so we have another question from Lauro about doing these experiments in a float tank. So I guess when you guys had like
yeah
you were looking at
getting more specific than that.
I'm asking if it would be more useful. Having more. They
really
said
funny.
something about having more control over the entire stimulation.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess the haptic will dominate in this case.
Yeah, no, it's really funny. So we never did it simultaneously, given the difficulty of bringing the hardware into a float tank. But a couple of different times, actually, we did the LSV right after sensory deprivation of about an hour or an hour and a half, and your nervous system is that's like the pinnacle of an open nervous system in many ways. Depending on how you kind of engage with the float tank experience. But in the times that we used this device right after, it had a very large impact. And in those cases, you would basically want to start right away with super simple, very consonant tones. Because if you stimulated somebody with like a statistical fractal, for example, it would probably be way too agitating. But that's a great point, and I've had several conversations about how something like this could be integrated at the end of a float tank, you have a float tank location, and they have, a prototype like this that can easily transition between the float tank experience and, whatever's going on when they leave the doors of the facility.
Okay, I think unless more questions come through, I'll end the stream there.
Or I think there might be one question. Maybe we lost it.
There was a really specific question. I think someone's actually currently using a haptic device. They're asking, I'm putting 50 hertz in sine and it is not heard or felt. Is more volume required? It only on the skin if I change the sawtooth or square. So that's very specific and technical. I didn't fix that.
I think you should be able to feel it. But there was another question which was like, can you modulate the frequency or the location specifically to kind of release the stock energy or something like that? I just wanted to kind of like quickly comment there. Yeah. So I mean, basically, like the very big promise here, and I think something that is really exciting is, the potential for actually even, using this as a diagnosis tool. That like, okay, like let's, in a sense, most people, if they're healthy, the number of nerves that we have in our nervous system is like very large, but it's not infinite. In that sense, like, if you kind of like run through a standardized set of patterns, it's kind of like, okay, like here's this particular vibration, this light, sound, and body vibration. You should be able to feel a particular resonance in this part of the body. Do you feel it? And if you don't feel it, it's like, oh, okay, so that part, there might be like a stuck nerve, or there might be like something that isn't quite working quite right. Like, okay, like a different pattern of stimulation. You should be able to feel some kind of feeling of entanglement or coupling between these two parts of your body. Are you feeling it? And if not, like, okay, that actually might be a sign of, depression or anxiety. Like in depressed people, that kind of, information or energy transmission just doesn't happen. So, and then perhaps, with kind of like neural annealing practices or paradigms, like, let's actually kickstart and with Hebbian learning, get those two parts of the nervous system to now start interacting with each other. So, I think the promise is both diagnosis and very, super targeted healing, like super targeted kind of like fixing of the missing, vibrations and resonances. So anyway, just wanted to mention that.
And actually another question from me, maybe to stimulate the minds of any eager entrepreneurs that might be watching this. So you've kind of touched on this, but what kind of more mature haptic device, like what would the perfect haptic device look like for you?
This could go a variety of ways with increasing levels of complexity. But just base hardware, I think you want to find the sweet spot of the number of actuators that are being used. So for example, I mentioned the MIT Media Lab suit in 2003 or something had 13 actuators. I never got to try this, so I don't know how great that was. The prototype that we ended up with at the end of this project has 3 different, well, I guess you could think of it as 3 separate haptic pillows, which are each receiving independent patterns of stimulation. So I think finding the optimal sweet spot of the number of actuators and the number of different places on the body you can place them is, the next step. I think having some form of bio or neurofeedback, so such as what we talked about with heart rate or breathing rate, or potentially even in pairs with somebody else, having playing a pattern of stimulation that's actually synced to like multiple people's heart rate in a room. Very interesting. Neurofeedback, as I mentioned before, with like real-time analysis of something like EEG. And then definitely simple moves to make our optimizing for safety and like the feeling of safety and comfort. So weighted blankets, and I would assume a lot of the work that's being done in psychedelic therapy clinics. yeah, there's a whole host of them. So yeah, if somebody is entrepreneurially minded, then again, definitely reach out. Yeah, I have been thinking about that a lot. So yeah, would love input and help, etc. Reach out to either Andres or I or anybody on the CureI team.
Okay, I think that brings us to the end. It's now 8:30. Thank you everyone at QRI, and obviously especially Sean and Andres who are here today answer our questions. That was a really good presentation, very interesting. So Andres will be back on this channel to talk at a later date. I'll let everyone know when that is happening. So, all right, until next time.
Awesome. Thanks. Thank you guys so much for having us. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Till later.